Hello. Welcome to my channel Touching Stories. You're about to hear an amazing story about love and unexpected decisions. Enjoy watching. Victor set the comb aside on the lacquered one. He looked in the mirror at his hair for neatness, adjusted his tie, and put a gold-framed watch on his wrist. It promised to be a difficult day, but it should bring peace of mind to a man's heart. The chime of the antique clock, signifying the arrival of 9 o'clock in the morning, rang through the living room. On the table, the telephone rang. Hello? Yes. The man nervously tied the lace on his black shoe. No, and I won't be in till after lunch. Leave the papers on my desk and tell him I'll call him myself, and we'll discuss it then. But in the meantime, don't bother me. Did your secretary get it all mixed up again? Into the living room literally floated plastic-gate, slender brunette. Honestly, you certainly have the stamina of an iron. Help me, please. She threw a long plume of glossy hair to one side and turned her back gently, inviting him to zipper up her overly tight black dress. Nothing. Victor pulled the zipper up. I started out that way myself, and I was confused about a lot of things too. My mistakes cost me more, though. The man grinned. A black business car was speeding down the highway. The driver kept his eyes on the road and pretended he wasn't here. The cabin smelled like a new car, an expensive perfume, and jazz came softly from the speakers. Can you imagine? Nicholas bought a dog of fighting breed. He wants to show it in fights. The man showed the girl a picture of a young pit bull puppy on his phone, and she rounded her eyes. I can't understand it. It's pathetic to watch them fight, especially when you're raising her. She's like part of the family. I couldn't agree with you more. It's very inhumane. There was a playfully troubled face in the window. Thin fingers brushed her hair. Now the girl was satisfied with her appearance. I told him the same thing. The main thing is, if only he'd done it professionally. But no, after a month he gave up this new hobby, and where to put the dog. Victor looked anxiously out the window. Judging by the scenery, they were already close. The car slowed down and slowly, like a huge crocodile, slid onto the trail. There was gravel beneath the wheels, and the driver took an even closer look at the road. For an extra scratch on that car, he would have had to give half his salary. Pulling up, Victor. The guy heard the scrape of gravel on the metal, but convinced himself he imagined it. I'll take the car to the parking lot, and when you come back, I'll come up here again. No, we'll come over here, said the man, already halfway out of the car. Karen, will you get out? I'm out now. There was a soft, sarcastic voice over Victor's spirit. Oh, you frightened me. I can't get used to how silently you move. The girl chuckled contentedly, tossing back a lock of hair. The gray sky hung heavily over Victor's head, trying to ruin his overly neat hair with tiny raindrops. As if feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, the man stood with a dejected gaze. His shoulders slumped forward, and his palms involuntarily clenched and unclenched, as if to give strength and courage to his owner. At last he took a step and came close enough to his goal. In his hands was a large commemorative wreath, studded with many red roses. Behind an ornate black fence were 2 graves with gray stone tombstones. From the marble slabs, a man and a woman were looking at him, to want him not to realize their direct kinship. Now he was not Victor, the successful businessman and determined executive who terrified his competitors. No, he had shrunk to the little boy who hid diaries with bad grades from his mother and stealthily sneaked cigarettes from his father. The man also remembered their small apartment on the outskirts of town. It constantly smelled through the lopsided windows, and so his parents had hung a rug with a deer frozen in the picture above his bed, to keep the room at least warm. His mother was always away at work. She was a pediatrician, so when she came home in the evenings, she smelled strongly of medicine, medical alcohol, and chlorine. Little one loved that smell. His father worked part-time odd jobs, but he never drank, and he played chess with his son in the evenings. That's what instilled in the future businessman a love of strategy. A sharp gust of wind struck the man in the face and tore him from his memories. He heard light sobs behind him. "Karen, are you cold?" "Let's go now," Victor remembered his companion anxiously. He looked back at her face. She was wrapped in her coat, and only her green eyes, filled with tears, were visible. She lowered her eyes ashamedly, trying to hide her tears. "My parents are dead too." Her trembling voice came out. "I didn't tell you. I just couldn't accept the thought myself." She wrapped herself even tighter in her coat, as if she were trying to hide from the outside world. "I miss them so much." Victor wrapped his arms around her, holding her head against his chest. He understood too well how she felt to torture her with questioning. They stood, hugged together, thinking each to himself, when a shrill child's voice sounded in their direction. "Mama, mama." A little blonde girl, about 6 years old, no more, was running toward Karen. She was wearing a white pony sweater tucked into a denim jumpsuit. The children's thin hair was tangled and looked like bast. Spreading her arms out to her sides, the girl ran up to the girl and smashed into her leg with a hug. "Mom, I missed you so much. Where have you been? You didn't leave me, did you? Did you come to get me?" said the child, raising her doll's blue eyes to the girl. Victor looked questioningly at his companion. Karen was drenched in color, but the next moment she turned white, as if she had seen a ghost. "What's the matter, little girl? I'm not your mother," she squeezed out in a trembling voice. "This is the first time I've seen your eyes." The girl's voice began to rise nervously. Victor looked around. Where could this little girl have even come from? It seemed to be the first time he'd really looked around in years. The cemetery was in a dismal state. The shrubbery had taken over the edge of the grounds and built a green wall, and the paths were littered with dry grass and candy wrappers. Crows were circling over some of the graves, looking for food. He only now noticed that they were alone in the cemetery. No adults were around. "Little girl, who are you with?" Victor's words went unanswered. The girl tapped Karen on the knee with her little fist and disappeared into the thicket of bushes. The couple remained standing, trying to comprehend what had happened. A chime of bells rang through the cemetery. It meant that it was noon and Victor's free time was over. It was time to return to his work life. The drive back passed in silence. Only soft jazz came from the car speakers. In the cabin, it was warm. The man gathered his strength after the walk and immersed himself in thought. Karen was reading something on her phone, and he watched the raindrops running across the glass. Where had that girl come from? And how could a child mistake someone for her mother? The round wooden doors obediently opened, and the girl entered the house. She tiredly threw off her shoes, which seemed like a huge weight, and flopped down heavily on the floor. "Karen, is that you?" The housekeeper came running out of the living room. She wore a perfectly pressed blue uniform and soft work shoes. "Oh, you're wet." The woman helped her out of her coat and hung it neatly on the shoulders. "The cashmere won't go bad if you hang it up neatly," the lady smiled. "I'll make you some tea. You must be cold." "Thank you, Irina." The girl walked tiredly to her room. A warm light burned over the luxurious red marble sink. The sound of water, reminiscent of the lapping of the waves, wafted through the room. The air was filled with the gentle scent of lavender. Karen stood in front of the mirror and looked at her reflection furtively. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The skin around her eyes was red and looked inflamed. She gazed into her reflection, searching fiercely for flaws. A network of lines in the corner of her eyes, the forehead creased with worry and thought, the corners of her mouth lowered by damned gravity. Beauty was dissolving with each new year, and there was no stopping it. This might be the last year when she would still have time to carry out her plans. All she had to do was push herself harder. She couldn't give up now. The blood rushed to her head and flooded her face. Her eyes were so noisy, she stopped knowing where she was. All she wanted to do was scream as hard as she could. The girl squeezed her eyes shut and slapped herself on the cheek. There was no pain. Then she tapped herself on the other cheek with the palm of her hand. She pounded herself, staggering around the bathroom like a wild animal cornered, until she realized the nervous tension was over. "Karen, are you all right?" An anxious voice came from behind the door, following a timid knock. Yes, Irina, don't worry. It was me who was dancing in front of the bathroom," Yaron answered tremblingly, and nervously pulled a smile over her face to make her voice sound cheerful. The fireplace crackled cozily in the living room, barely illuminating the large room, and the girl lay in Victor's arms, slowly twirling a strand of her hair around her finger. With her other hand, she stroked her leg. The sight put Victor in a light trance. "Karen, I wondered if we could have a baby too. That little girl in the cemetery really got under my skin. A girl is a girl, and she's not even well-mannered." As she interrupted him sharply, but realizing her voice sounded too cold, purring, she added, "Of course we'll have the baby, darling." "Only after the wedding I'm still a decent lady," she laughed, pouring the rest of the red wine into the glasses. For several days the man suffered from nightmares. That little girl in the pony sweater came to him in his dreams. Then the bushes hovered over her in a black cloud and dragged the child away into the darkness. The little girl screamed, pulling her little arms toward him. Victor ran toward her as hard as he could and tried to reach her, but a flock of crows swooped down on him. There was no way he could resist them. The man woke up in a cold sweat on the damp sheets. "Man, you can't go on like this. You'll drive yourself to your grave." Nicholas, a longtime friend of Victor's, sat down on the edge of his huge office desk. "I'd love to get a good night's sleep, but I can't help it. And my wife bought me some pills for sleeping, so I fall asleep in a minute. I'm sick of that dog barking, keeping me up at night. I hired a dog handler to deal with her during the day, but she is not enough." The man put a cup of coffee on the table. "And you want me to give you a couple of pills? I think I had another packet in the car." "Thanks, man, but I don't accept any of that." Victor looked around. Behind the glass wall of the office, numerous employees were scurrying, and the secretary immediately smiled at the boss with a friendly smile. "I don't want any of the employees to see you handing me pills." Rumors would fly at the speed of light, especially from my secretary. "Look, there she is, smiling. Maybe Karen's got a sister. I saw a news report yesterday about twins who were mistakenly separated in a maternity hospital and only met 30 years later, so they say that their whole lives were almost mirrored. It happens, doesn't it?" Nicholas's phone rang. It was his assistant. He said something quickly into the receiver, and the man said goodbye to his friend and hurried away. The thought that Karen might have had a sister stuck in the man's mind. It would explain everything. The girl had mistaken her mother for her sister, and Karen didn't even know she had one. Only there was no point in asking the girl directly. She obviously didn't know her sister existed. He didn't want to upset his fiancée, so he decided to find out for himself. It was getting dark when the car pulled up to the entrance of the cemetery. The light was on in the caretaker's little hut. Victor headed toward the building, and as he took a step, a flock of crows flew out from under his feet. The birds were clearly outraged by such impudence and were not expecting visitors at such a late hour. The man reflexively jumped, covering his head, but unsuccessfully placed his foot and fell right onto the dirty pavement. "Shit! Oh!" The businessman blurted out, and a frail, frightened driver peeked out of the car, offering his boss help. but the man gave him a sign with his hand that he could handle himself. As everyone who wanted to was dispersed, the man was able to get to the gatehouse unhindered. He went to the flimsy door and knocked. A sharp knock made the caretaker jump in place. He did not seem to have had many visitors in the evening. The caretaker was an elderly man, slightly hunched over. He wore square, horn-rimmed spectacles, which made his eyes look disproportionately large. He had a small, square television set, and obviously Victor had distracted him from watching the show. The old man was obviously not going to get out of the old lady when some rich man in an expensive car comes to the cemetery, almost at night, and wants something from him. Going out to meet him didn't seem like a great idea at all. He stuck his head out the window and asked what he could do to help. Fortunately, Victor was able to explain to him the story that had happened to him the other day. The man took a critical look at his visitor, but nonetheless decided he did not look like a maniac who preyed on little girls and was able to help with some information. That's the orphanage over there, behind the bushes. He pointed his finger to the right. So those kids during the day, while it's light, they run over here. They steal candy or gingerbread. I don't chase them away. I feel sorry for them. I like sweets myself. Where do they get it? I don't remember their names, but I've seen the one you described here many times. She has an unusual name, Suzanne or Viola. The man hesitated, looking up, as if there might be a clue written on the ceiling. Looking up as if there might be a clue written on the ceiling. But you go up to the orphanage during the day. They have a friendly director there. He'll help you with that question. Thank you very much. You helped me a lot. Victor held out his hand at the pale bars of the window. Victor, it's a pleasure. Michael, likewise. The old man extended his hand in return, and they sealed their acquaintance with a handshake. The next day, driven by inexplicable inner anxiety, Victor stood at the doorstep of the orphanage. In the yard, children of all ages were running around. The children were spinning hoops, playing with balls, and cooking with leaves, grass, and sand. The mysterious girl was not in the yard. No sooner had the man crossed the threshold than he was greeted by one of the workers, smiling graciously at his guest. She escorted the man to the principal's office on the second floor. It was a modestly arranged room with a slightly dusty lamp hanging from the ceiling and a desk on which a simple computer stood solemnly. There was a filing cabinet by the wall, stuffed with students' personal files, and on the desk was stationery, amazingly evenly laid out, as if according to a ruler. Guests did not seem to be welcomed in the institution very often, and the headmaster relieved himself by going through the items. Opposite the director's chair stood a visitor's chair. You could even call it a chair, an ordinary black office chair, but a strange rainbow-colored cape was carefully hanging on it. Children's drawings hung on the milky pink walls. Crooked suns, rainbows, and butterflies with the signatures of their authors mottled across the room, and the sight gave his guest a lump in his throat. It's one thing to hear about orphanages on television, but it's quite another to be here. Good to see you, Victor. The gray-haired man held out his hand in greeting. He leaned across the table to do so, and Victor couldn't help noticing that his tie was somewhat thicker than it is now worn. I was very surprised by your call. I'm glad you decided to stop by. Thank you for the warm welcome, Sergio. You have here. The man sat down in the chair opposite and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. A lump in his throat still prevented him from taking a full breath. The businessman took a breath and put his sentiments out of his mind. As a matter of fact, I've already explained to you briefly on the phone what happened. Yes, I knew at once who you mean. There's only one girl like that. This sweater she literally refuses to take off, so it was easy to find her. Suzanne, that's a sad story. This is not the life she was destined to have, but fate is a fiend. The man twirled a blue pen in his hands in frustration. This picture, by the way, she drew. He pointed with the tip of the pen to a picture hanging near the door in a thin wooden frame. It was a sheet, slightly yellowed around the edges, showing a family of 3. In the background of the house was the father, a tall blonde man, the mother, a slender brunette, and the girl herself in a pink dress with daisies in her hand. How did she get to you? Well, that's confidential information, the director blushed shyly and covered himself with thick paint. Apparently trades with the conscience he had not held before, but his institution had few investors. Yes, I will not stay in debt. Just tell me how I can help you. Don't get me wrong. I just want to help the kids from the bottom of my heart. I grew up, I would have told you anyway. If I can get Suzanne into a good home, it means I've lived my life for a reason. The man finally put his pen on the table. She came to us recently, just a couple of years ago. Actually, her father was well off. He had a successful farm, his own production. He also had real estate. In general, he wanted to arrange a bright future for his daughter. He didn't even make it to 40. He didn't even make it to 40. He died of a heart attack. Frankly speaking, it was the first time I met with such a thing at that age. The director crossed his arms on his stomach thoughtfully. And really, it's a bit early. What about the girl's mother? That's where the little girl had no luck at all. Someone crashed through the door. A child's crying went up, and the director ran out into the corridor to deal with the situation. Through the doorway, Victor saw him pulling apart 6-year-old boys who were fighting over something. One grabbed the other by the hair, and when the principal tried to pull them apart, he reached for the principal's tie. He was now forced to crouch on the floor and literally fight for his life. The kids were amused by this picture and started grabbing him by the hair and pulling his ears. The other kids ran up to the noise, and the whole second floor was filled with children's laughter. There was no stopping it. Quietly, the woman who had met Victor downstairs came up. "Come on, I'll take you to the girl. She's painting now." Victor slowly followed his guide. The woman was not old and moved slowly. They went down to the first floor and walked down a long corridor to the playroom. The floors throughout the building were covered with red carpets, and Victor noticed that in some places they were almost worn to the holes. He remembered his own reindeer rug in the nursery. At the sides were the sleeping quarters. The doors to them were wide open, and the man peered in curiously. There were at least 20 beds in each, all neatly arranged. Some had soft toys lying on them. A lump rolled up to my throat again. A nervous shudder struck the businessman, as if he were going to the most fateful meeting of his life. He remembered how he had concluded his first big contract. At that time he was trembling with excitement and was afraid he would faint. His mother had advised him to drink chamomile to calm him, and it had worked. But he didn't have any herbs with him now. His palms were sweaty and his forehead was slightly sweaty. He suddenly felt very hot. Victor stopped and pulled off his jacket, which was obstructing his breathing. Seeing this picture, a woman brought him water. He drank the icy water and forced his heart to come to a calm rhythm. The woman, smiling slightly, reassured the man, saying that this was a normal reaction, and everyone gets nervous before meeting their children. The wide room with floor to ceiling windows was bright and free. A few children were sitting in the corner, making plasticine figures. Nearer to the window stood a small easel, to which was attached a sketchbook. Behind it sat a little girl with 2 ponytails. One of the rubber bands had slipped out of her hair and was hanging down, but the little girl obviously did not care. She was absorbed in the process and was quite dangling her legs. "Susan, honey, you have a visitor. This is Victor. Come and say hello." The woman spoke in a soft and gentle voice, putting the child in a friendly mood. "Come to me." The girl dropped the plastic brush and hurriedly turned toward the voice. "I remember you. Are you the man from the park?" The girl brushed her hair out of her face, and her forehead and cheeks were streaked with red and yellow paint. She looked at Victor studyingly. "Your name is Susan, isn't it?" All the words flew out of the businessman's head, and he lost his train of thought. Now all his prepared phrases and questions seemed to him silly and not real. "Are you and my mother here? Is she here?" The girl peered curiously behind the man's back, looking to see if anyone was in the hallway. Was that your mother? You didn't mix it up, did you? Yes, it was. We all used to live on a farm together. I had rabbits and a dog there. I lived there with my mom and dad. Did you come to get me? Suzanne, I've come to meet you. I have to go now, but I'll come and see you again. Okay, the girl whispered, confused, and lowered her gaze to the floor. Victor felt like his heart was going to jump out of his chest. His ears were buzzing and unable to find anything better to do. He hurried outside. The sky was overcast with gray clouds and the smell of lawn was in the air. Thunderstorm was looming. The man rested his hands on his knees to catch his breath for a while when the caretaker came up to him. Victor, are you all right? The woman looked anxiously into his face. These children can make you nervous, I know. She fixed the shawl again. A cold wind was rising. I am well, thank you. I didn't sleep very well last night. What about that farm where she lived? I'm not sure. But it wasn't just the farm. It was my father's fortune, too. Only it's all gone. I think someone took it. I mean, her father lived with a woman. Maybe she knows something. The nanny kept an eye on the kids in the yard. Not rich, but here, the man led his hands across the room. There's obviously a need for financial support. I won't bother you anymore. I would like to ask you to tell the director to send me a list of things I need by email. All right. The educator answered as she ran down the steps. Among her charges again brewed battle with plastic hoops, not to life but to death. There was no more time to talk. The man was glad of this. He was gripped by intense inner turmoil. He hurried to his car. The familiar surroundings gave him the relief he needed. He did not notice how the next month flew by. Several times a week he visited Suzanne in the orphanage. The girl proved to be very sociable. Sometimes before he went home, he would stop by the cemetery to visit his parents' grave. The endless grief was replaced by a slight sadness. He wished he could introduce his parents to the girl who drove away his loneliness. An acquaintance with the cemetery caretaker turned into a buddy relationship. One weekday, Victor, walking past the glass building where his office was located, saw a puppy. The little brown lump squealing and calling for help. There were no parents or owners nearby. The businessman passed by at first, but then he remembered the drawing of the girl the day he first came to see her. Of course, it was against all the rules, but after long negotiations with the director, he was allowed to give the puppy to the girl on the condition that a kennel would be put outside for the animal, since according to the sanitary standards, it was impossible to keep an animal in the institution. The woolly lump he placed in a box. Fortunately, there were plenty of them in the office, and a set of bedding paper worked. On the way to the orphanage, Victor stopped at the store. The variety struck him. There was a huge number of toys, goodies, food, and even colorful costumes for dogs. The friendly sales assisted him in selecting anything he might need to care for his pet. They didn't have ready-made kennels, but they had prefabricated ones. Victor hadn't held a tool in his hand in a long time, but decided that he should be able to handle a kennel. He chose a large winter model. On the assembled wall, the booth had 4 wooden walls, made to look like a log cabin. An oval passageway was made as the entrance, on which a protective trim was fastened in case of bad weather. The red roof angled out on all 4 sides, extending beyond the walls. It even had a small black chimney, simulating an exit from the fireplace. Underneath, the structure was anchored to a wide platform that would protect the animal from the cold ground. An interior insulator was also included. Victor was amazed at how far progress had come in this matter. He remembered that the last time he'd seen a booth, it was a hollowed-out box of thin wood paneling with raw edges and gaping holes. And so it stood in the next yard where an old lame dog lived. Suzanne was delighted. The girl first cried when she saw the puppy and then threw herself around Victor's neck, squealing with delight when she heard about the animal. All the children poured out into the yard and vied with each other to suggest different names. Assembling the kennel was easy. All the blocks were easy to fasten to each other, were inserted into the grooves, and the man did not even have to use the tools brought by the director. He watched the child play with the puppy, and a warm feeling enveloped him. She said she wanted a home like the doggies, too. To take her in an armful now and carry her home to the fireplace. Irina would make dinner. Delicious. Homemade. Not like here. Kern's disgruntled face flashed before my eyes. The man still hadn't said anything to his chosen one. He didn't know why, but every time he wanted to say he was visiting the little girl, he was stopped by an inner voice. He should have a better look at the girl. After all, he lived with her. Through an acquaintance, he helped Victor find a neighbor. That farmer. The man agreed to meet. And that evening, they were already sitting in a restaurant in the city center. In fact, I myself was surprised at how quickly everything happened then. Everything literally happened in just a few days. I remember looking out the window and seeing the blue-red lantern of the rescue service, and it caught my attention. I saw someone being carried out, but I couldn't see in the dark. A man was twisting the stem of a wine glass. Well, it happens, I thought, and a day later, the house was for sale. Strange, of course. No funeral, no wake. I only found out about Andrei's death after a while from some acquaintances. What did the woman he lived with look like? His wife was a young, pretty girl. Dark hair, long green eyes, slim but not sociable. I used to visit her in my neighborhood, but she was always hiding somewhere. I never saw her up close in those 2 years. The man took a sip of wine. Suzanne was very young then. She was about 3 or 4, I don't remember exactly. Her mother died in childbirth, and Andrew called her new wife his mother. I also thought at the time that the idea might not be a bad one, so that the child would not be traumatized. As it turned out, the woman ended up giving her up in an orphanage, and she went into hiding, embezzling all her husband's money. There were no checks on Andrei either. They say he had a heart attack. But I honestly don't know for sure. And now I think maybe it's even good that she gave the girl away. She might have avoided the same fate. A bitch like that would hardly have made a good mother. Victor stared at the night view of the city. It was as if a huge stone hung over his soul. Could it be his Karen? But he could not say that from her description alone. Victor made a sign, and the waiter helpfully poured more wine into the glass. His companion was long gone, but he could not bring himself to go home. With each new sip, his blood boiled more and more in his veins, and he was afraid of saying too much. Years of building his business had taught him iron restraint. He did not make hasty decisions and did not give vent to his emotions. What if it was her? Could she be so intent on killing him like a black widow? He remembered how they had met. Winter. The girl had slipped on the icy patch right in front of the business center, and Victor had caught her. The lights of the city at night brought a sense of longing and loneliness. Staggering, the man reached the parking lot, where the driver was already waiting for him. It was a little stuffy in the cabin, and jazz was blasting from the speakers. As usual, Victor was even more thirsty, and he decided that he needed to make inquiries about his fiancée. "We'll follow Karen tomorrow." The driver's surprised eyes reflected in the rearview mirror. Yeah, you heard right. Do me a favor and I'll pretend I didn't see the bumper scratch." The young man nervously and with a small nod confirmed his readiness to perform the task. The dark street was lit by the only dim red of the street lamp. A female figure was approaching toward Victor, moving her hips. When the silhouette was quite close, the man finally got a glimpse of his beloved's face. She was wearing a red floor-length dress that emphasized all the advantages of her figure. She had a high cut on her left leg, and red lipstick accentuated the fatal image in the dim light of the lantern. Her skin looked dead pale. The girl pressed close to him, and he felt her warm breath on his cheek. Reaching out, Karen stroked the man's face, cheeks, and chest. She looked at him with a mocking look and suddenly pushed away, beginning to laugh gleefully. Her laughter turned into the hysterical cackle of a hyena, and an unhealthy fire glittered in her eyes. The girl laughed and laughed non-stop. Only now did Victor notice that she wasn't wearing shoes, but that didn't seem to bother her. She spread her arms out to her sides and began to whirl around herself, humming an unfamiliar tune. Victor noticed another silhouette under the streetlight. The same woman strokes his cheek and laughs. Now the two figures were spinning in a crazy dance. Victor could not move even a finger to move. Another silhouette, smooth hips, floating hair, warm breath on his cheek. The girls came up and up until the entire space around them was filled with frantic laughter and dancing. Victor finally emerged from his stupor. He was thrashing around in the middle of the hysteria, unable to find a way out. He grabbed his hands over his head and screamed, crouching down on his knees. In an instant, all the women turned into ravens and glided through the air on black wings, sweeping over him and trailing the tips of their feathers. Victor sat up on the bed. The sheets were damp. His heart was pounding like it was going to jump out of his chest. He sat for a few minutes, staring at the wall in front of him and forcing his tired brain to shed the sticky memories of the disturbing nightmare. It was almost noon on the clock. A cold shower chased away the remnants of a heavy night. Karen wasn't home, according to Irina. She had run away on business, and the man was unspeakably glad of that. He did not want to see her now. It was not her fault, of course, that he had surrendered, but lately he had been avoiding seeing his fiancée more and more. There was a growing tension between them, an abyss of mystery and suspicion. It was still too early to hear from the driver, and he did not know what to do with himself. He would very much like to see Suzanne cuddling a puppy now, to play with her, maybe even read her a story, as his parents had read to him in his childhood. But it was impossible to go to the girl with yesterday's breath. Victor noticed he was home alone for the first time in a long time. He decided to check Karen's things. Despite sharing a bedroom, she had a separate room where the girl kept her outfits, suitcases, and personal belongings. Victor had never looked in there, but now curiosity gripped his mind. Upon entering the room, the man was a little confused. He didn't know what to look for or where to start. He decided to look around and see what he could find. Nothing much caught his eye. Clothes were neatly hung in the closet, and underwear was also impeccably folded in adjusted drawers. Cosmetics were on the mirror table. Victor checked the suitcases. Empty. There was nothing of interest under the sofa either. Having looked around the room, he sat down flat on the floor. It was not good. It turns out that there is nothing, and it is all one big mistake. The man leaned back and rested on his hands. Suddenly he noticed a slippery spot under his right arm. There was something under the carpet. Victor hurriedly pushed it aside. On the floor lay a small, burgundy-colored velvet pouch. It certainly couldn't have gotten in here by accident. Victor carefully took the pouch and pulled the leather walls apart. Something glittered inside. The man slowly poured the contents of the pouch onto his hand and froze in a daze. On his palm were wedding and engagement rings. Some of them had impressive-sized diamonds. 6 rings and several pairs of earrings. He stared at the treasure he had found for a long time and didn't know what to do with it. Putting it back would be foolish. To call the police would be illogical. In the man's mind, there was a mental trial of the bride. The prosecution was saying that she was guilty, that she was the Black Widow, that she had killed everyone, deceived everyone, and was now hunting another naive victim. The defense countered that this could not be considered evidence, and that the gold might have come to the girl from her parents. And what the farmer's neighbor said proved nothing. After all, there are plenty of girls with that appearance. And Suzanne survived the tragic events at such an early age that, of course, a child's imagination could have transferred the image of her mother to a similar person. The man sucked in air greedily and looked around. On the table by the window, next to the bouquet, in a crystal vase, was a photograph of them together. In it, he was gently embracing the girl by the waist, and there were smiles on their faces. No need to jump to conclusions. You have to ask Karen directly, that's all. He put the pouch with the secret treasure in his pocket. Said Ira was cleaning up, accidentally found it and handed it to him. He heard the gate to the yard open and realized the bride had come home. Karen was acting absolutely as usual. "You're so serious today." The girl took her arms around the groom's neck and rested her head on his shoulder. Victor still couldn't find the words to start the conversation. "Honey, are you by any chance a murderer?" Yeah, that would have sounded funny. And how to approach it from afar. Do you happen to remember giving any baby away to an orphanage 2 years ago? Well, that doesn't sound good either. Did you remember what day it was? The girl giggled snidely. I don't remember. He almost choked on his steak. Today is the day we met. Irina, would you be so kind as to bring us a bottle of champagne? They sat at the table near the window for the rest of the day. The evening lights were on, their rays reflecting off the snow that had barely fallen. The flakes fell in a fluffy cloud and gave inner peace. Victor wished he could forget everything that had happened to him lately, but he could not go back in time. The velvet pouch in the pocket of his home pants burned his leg with unpleasant suspicion. Okay, it had to be done just to ask. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything. Outside the gate, the headlights glinted. The gate slowly came into motion. Victor realized it was the driver, just in time. "Oh, well, I'll be right back. I have some instructions to give." Victor stood up slowly. He tried to speak softly and without too much pressure, so as not to frighten the companion. "Then you will tell me what it is." The pouch rested slowly on the table. The girl's eyes rounded in amazement. Bubbles of champagne chattered sadly from the glass, silently hinting that the pleasant part of the evening had come to an end. The car was quiet. Victor sat in the front seat, ready for any news as long as the evening was over. He was mentally exhausted, for all these secret suspicions had taken his strength. He was exhausted. "I did as you asked," the embarrassed chauffeur nervously babbled. "Here." I took the pictures. He handed Victor a puffy envelope. The man leafed through the pictures, and the chilling fragments of the mosaic formed a coherent picture in his mind. The pictures showed Karen in the company of a respectable man in a hotel cafe. The pictures showed the couple laughing, exchanging kisses. Further away, they could see the man standing at the front desk, and in the last pictures, they were going into the interior of the hotel. There must have been elevators to the rooms. It was all very clear now. Karen and Suzanne's mother are one person. Although her infidelity did not indicate that she was a murderer, her intuition literally screamed that this was exactly what he suspected. Victor had long noticed that Karen still avoided meeting his friends. He had written it off to the girl's modesty. But now, holding pictures of her shameful sins in his hands, Karen's modesty could be forgotten, as well as her honesty. Had she been lying the whole time? The blood boiled in his veins? "Thank you," the man tossed as he went. Karen stood in the far corner of the room, staring into the darkness. Victor didn't even notice her right away. The warm air hit his face, his throat dry with accumulated anger. He wanted to grab the damn girl and throw her out into the street right now, the way she had done to his feelings, to the unhappy child. After all, the girl still thought it was her mother who had abandoned her. Victor finished his glass of champagne with one peep and tossed the envelope on the table. Evidence of infidelity slipped onto the table. "I think you've been drinking a lot lately." The girl's voice sounded cold and detached. At your age, it is very dangerous to your health. What is she saying? Victor felt very faint. He suddenly couldn't get enough air. I thought everything was going well, and it's a girl who ruined everything, and I didn't touch her. Ungrateful bitch. Karen's eyes sparkled with an unhealthy, fanatical gleam. She sat down in the chair opposite, though her face was unflappable. Her leg twitched treacherously, nervously. Her forehead was sweaty, and thin precum of long, dark hair clung to it. I thought I'd have time to do everything as planned. The girl flipped across the table, found herself close to Victor's face, and peered into his eyes. He tried greedily to take in air with his mouth, but nothing worked. A sharp pain in his chest spread throughout his body. His eyes went dark, the poisoned drink burning everything from the inside out. He should have put the cameras on after all. He had been advised long ago. He hesitated and did not have time. The last thing Victor saw was Karen's predatory, maddened smile. The man fell to the floor and was engulfed in darkness. There was a wild scream of terror through the house. When Irina ran to the scream, she caught a picture that took her breath away. Karen was sitting on the floor, clutching Victor to her chest. The girl's face was tear-drenched, her mascara smeared, her lipstick too, her hair carelessly finished. She tried to massage his heart, pushing on his chest. The man lay on the floor with his glassy eyes open, a thin trickle of blood flowing from the corner of his mouth. A few moments later, the red and blue lights of the ambulance flashed at the gate. At a loss for words, Irina sat down on the steps and watched the paramedics arrive, sleepwalking. They checked the pulse and confirmed death. 2 paramedics brought a stretcher. The body was covered with a protective sheet and carried away. It all went by like a fog. The funeral was not in the will that Victor had written with his lawyer. Years ago, it was stipulated that he wanted to be buried in the cemetery next to his parents. This is how it happened. Next to the 2 old graves, there was one new one. The caretaker looked sadly at the fresh mound of earth. But such a good man and gone so early. The director learned of Victor's death only from his secretary when he called his office. The man was in shock. He really liked Victor. And it was a shame about Suzanne, too. He had seen such caring in the eyes of prospective adoptive parents many times. Victor really could have been a caring father to the girl. The child was in for another blow of fate. The little girl sat dejectedly on the edge of the bed and listened to the heavy speech of the director. He tried to speak as softly and gently as possible, but the little girl already knew what he was talking about. She had been spoken to in this tone before. After the last such conversation, she found herself here. The girl's lips and chin trembled, and she threw herself on the pillow with her face, sobbing loudly while the man stroked her back affectionately and promised to take her to see Victor when she could come to her senses. Toward evening, Suzanne was ready. On her face were small creases from the pillow. After much sobbing, the girl fell asleep and slept most of the day. Before going to the cemetery, she decided to take her puppy with her. He loved Victor too. Sergio did not object. The man understood how important it was to the girl. He helped her put the harness on the puppy and gave her the leash in her hands. After wrapping up warmly, they went to the cemetery. It got dark early in the winter, and the headmaster wanted to go back sooner. He didn't want the sight of the cemetery at night to imprint itself on the child's memories. She had too much on her mind as it was. The puppy, for the first time since he had his mistress, was outside the gate. He was very curious about everything. He was sticking his wet, curious nose into the leaves and jumping through puddles and drifts. Already, after 5 minutes of walking, the dog was like a lump of mud. The smell of fresh earth hung in the air. The man's naked eye saw a fresh mound at the end of the path. The black, wet mound stood out brightly against the backdrop of the old settled graves. The sorrowful sobs of a child reached him, and they stopped several times so that the girl could blow her nose and soothe herself. At one point, the puppy was completely left to himself and snatched the leash from the little girl's hands. Now he was running between the graves, tail tucked, and exploring the smells. The director wiped Suzanne's face with tears and kept one eye on the puppy. It wasn't enough that another puppy was missing. The dog came upon a familiar scent and ran up to Victor's grave. Its tail waved hello from side to side, and it diligently sniffed the ground, running around. At the grave appeared 2 small children's feet in yellow rubber boots and 2 adults in winter boots. Sergio carefully watched what was going on and did not interfere in the process of saying goodbye to the baby to its almost new parent. Suddenly, the puppy started galloping around the grave, wagging his tail and trying to jump on top. The man tried to calm the animal, but the puppy only pouted more. He wriggled around in the man's arms and still wriggled out, finding himself free. The animal barked and began digging at the grave. The picture looked frightening. What could he see there? Sergio crossed himself. Suzanne also tried to comfort her younger friend. She jumped right on top of him and pinned him to the ground as the pup dug into the ground. Oops, there's a groan. The girl looked back at the principal with fright. Her eyes rounded. The man was dazed. What he certainly didn't want was for the poor girl to go mad with grief. A child's psyche is very fragile. Listen to me. She rushed over to the principal and grabbed him by the pant leg and pulled him toward her. There, I can hear it. The man touched the cross, mechanically. He took a step forward and bent over the grave. In the next instant, the man fell on his back, and catching his breath, reflexively crawled back a few steps. Groans were indeed heard from the grave. While the man was recovering, the girl ran after the caretaker, and the puppy continued insistently digging the hole. Moments later, the director saw the caretaker limping rapidly with shovels in his hands. He staggered toward the grave with all the speed he could muster, waving his arms wide. The man was wearing black tall rubber boots, winter pants, and a shirt. He seemed to have forgotten his jacket in a hurry. The girl who had been running ahead of him staggered forward and then back to the old man in an attempt to hurry him. The panting watchman stopped and threw a second shovel. A low groan and cough could be heard from the grave. The men's shovels shuffled around, dumping damp earth. Victor did not realize where he had come to. His head was splitting and his stomach was in pain. He tried to cough, but his throat was dry and his throat felt burned. He wanted to look around, but his eyes could barely see anything. Only cold and total darkness surrounded the man. He couldn't turn over either. Something was holding him back at his sides. What had happened? No memories came, and a piercing headache filled his entire being. The man lost consciousness. The next time he regained consciousness was with a deafening thud. Literally, next to his head, something was being knocked and broken out. He heard voices. It sounded like a child's voice and a dog barking. The darkness left him, and a gray expanse of crows, sky, and fresh, frosty air opened before his gaze. Light male hands lifted him behind his back and helped him sit up. Everything was floating before his eyes. The last thing he saw were red and blue lights. This time the man came to his senses in the warmth. The air smelled painfully familiar with the smell of chlorine and medical supplies. "Are you awake?" A ringing voice approached the man. His throat did not want to make a sound. Victor tried to sit up, finding an IV sticking out in his hand. The stomp of footsteps echoed from the corridor. A doctor and a nurse entered the room. The girl hurried to help him with the lifting mechanism, and the couch took a semi-vertical position. He was now clearly aware that he was in a hospital. What had happened? Karen's predatory smile and the unhealthy gleam of her maddened eyes flashed before his face. Victor shuddered. The doctors explained to him how his recovery would proceed. He would spend a month here in the hospital, but after that his health was no longer in danger. Suzanne did not leave his side even for a moment. She reached into his arms and affectionately adjusted his hospital clothes. He looked at this little angel and realized that he did not want to part with the girl for an instant again. She was his daughter. A couple of weeks later, when Victor recovered, the police came to visit him. They questioned the businessman about his girlfriend. It turned out that, on her account, several deaths, and the girl's father was not the first, and, judging by her plans, not the last. Law enforcement officials shed light on what happened and how Victor ended up alive. He was very lucky. Karen was in a hurry, and when he got out to the driver's side, he didn't have time to calculate the exact dose. The man slipped into a coma, and only the doctor could detect his pulse. The girl thought he was dead. With the help of an accomplice, she managed to bypass law enforcement and bribe the right people. The body was buried without an autopsy. Those rings weren't legacies, after all. Victor smirked to himself. Lucky me, it turns out the month in the hospital flew by quickly. Victor was on the mend. Sergio visited him with the girl several times a week. The director did not hide his warm attitude toward Victor. He helped him in the shortest time to prepare the papers for custody, and by the time he was discharged from the hospital, Suzanne could go to her new home. The little girl spent a lot of time in the ward. She brought some of her toys and a drawing set, and now she could have all the fun she wanted. Mary, the blonde nurse who took care of Victor, often read stories to the girl when she had time. She had fair skin, sprinkled with freckles and kind eyes. Mash's voice lulled the weakened patient, and he often fell asleep to her reading. The girl was very caring. She smelled of chlorine and hospital. They became attached to her. A few months later, there was a trial, and Victor testified. Karen didn't say a word. His life had changed. He now had a daughter. The house was in full swing to renovate the nursery. A second kennel was being installed in the yard. Victor could no longer listen to his friend complain about how bored he was with his dog, and decided to take her in. Now the two teenage puppies were frolicking in the yard, playing catch-up. The house was filled with laughter and voices. Victor had the feeling that he was just now getting a life. Mary proved to be not only caring, but a sweet and kind girl. Victor found that they had much in common, and before he knew it, he himself had fallen in love. Suzanne, too, had grown attached to Mary. The only thing that troubled Victor's soul was the complicated history of the little girl's past. It would turn out that she would think that her own mother had killed her father and then nearly killed him himself. He did not want such a heavy imprint on the girl's fate. Finding her real mother's grave proved not difficult. Victor again turned to an authentic friend, and he was able to find the address in no time at all. The man did not know how to uncover the dark secret of the girl's past and sought the advice of a child psychologist. Together they were able to find the right words, and now the man was determined. But he did not expect that the girl would take everything so calmly. Apparently, the killer's cold attitude helped the little girl easily accept that this woman meant nothing in her life. Victor was amazed at how such a small person could realize such big thoughts. A child's seat appeared in the luxurious interior of a black executive car, and, dangling her legs, a little girl sat in it. She was wearing an ornate navy blue dress, star tights, and a shiny jacket. She was holding a stuffed toy in her hands in the form of a white pony, and picturing it galloping through the air. Mary tried to correct her tales, but it seemed impossible. The car drove carefully, leaving the bustling city streets behind her. The sun was shining with a golden globe. Victor loosened the child's seat locks and helped the girl out of the car. He took the little girl by the right hand, and Mary gently took the small left hand. Together they walked to the ornate fence. Behind it was a white pedestal with an angel folding his arms in a prayerful pose. On the pedestal hung a photograph of the girl's deceased mother. Involuntarily, Victor and Suzanne looked back at Masha when they saw the picture. The resemblance between the women was striking. The same freckles, the same kind eyes, and modest smile. Mary didn't seem to notice anything in particular. At least she didn't show it. White roses were placed next to the tombstone. "Here rests a beloved wife and mother," the inscription read. That evening, Suzanne shared her secret with Victor. She said that Mary was her mother. She had her figured out. Victor couldn't help but agree. And what was there to hide? He had already proposed to Mary. Soon the young people were married. Suzanne was given the responsible role of arranging the flowers. The girl twirled in a white bride's dress, and in her hair was a wreath of lilies of the valley. The same flowers adorned Mary's hair. "Mama, you look so beautiful." The little girl was hugging the bride by her beautiful dress, "and your outfit is like a princess." The evening lights came on in the courtyard. Guests congratulated the young couple. Mary's parents and Victor's friends were there. No outsiders were present. A humble, intimate celebration for kindred spirits. A cover band sang hits from romantic movies. Victor was happy. He found his family. He found himself, and it seemed that at last he was breathing with his full heart. "Masha, I am so happy. I wish that this moment had never ended." He picked up the girl and whirled her in place at that moment when a star flew across the sky.